Hi, and welcome again to Different Class. I'm Nathan Charlton, and with me I have, as ever, Jonathan White. Hello, Jonathan.
Hello.
So this month's Different Class is titled Capitalising on Disaster. In this series of Different Class, we've been looking at states of emergency. And I think in the last three events, we've perhaps looked at states of emergency from a more theoretical perspective, and this month's event, I think, is a little more contemporary and perhaps more urgent in its subject matter. The texts that we are using as a starting point are by Naomi Klein. Klein is a Canadian activist and writer, a critic of globalization, and made her name initially with the book No Logo. One of the texts we're looking at this month is the shock doctrine, or from the shock doctrine, which was written in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. We're also looking at another text from last year by Klein, which addresses our more recent and current emergency, that of the pandemic. Jonathan, Klein made her name really with the concepts of the shock doctrine and disaster capitalism. What did she really mean, or what does she really mean by those terms?
So the basic idea, I think, is quite an intuitive one, which is that disasters, moments of great upheaval, are not just situations demanding some type of political response, but they are also situations that can be exploited in some fashion, and indeed can be exploited to pursue a certain set of policies, part of a larger political agenda. And for Klein, her focus is very much on how this shock doctrine is applied to essentially to push through policies that embed a certain kind of capitalism, policies of market liberalization, of privatization, and looking, well, the period spanning neoliberal capitalism, essentially from the 1970s onwards into the 21st century, and looking at how in countries around the world, from Chile to Russia to the United States, even around Hurricane Katrina, for example, or 9/11, how these are moments of great upheaval where basically it's possible to take advantage of populations under shock, hence the shock doctrine, to somehow bypass or disactivate democracy and to promote policies that otherwise might be quite unpopular policies. So it's the instrumentalization of situations of crisis, essentially.
I see. And she wrote this originally in 2008, and in many ways we've kind of moved beyond that kind of shock doctrine, haven't we? People perhaps are a little more skeptical of those kinds of strategy, I think. What would you say?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. In other words, in the period that Klein is documenting, neoliberals could often advance these policies according to the shock doctrine, partly because they were somehow able to present themselves as politically neutral, politically innocent, somehow external to the crises in question. So Klein starts a story with Milton Friedman and others of the so-called neoliberal thought collective, and basically traces how they were able through the 70s, 80s to take advantage of these moments of upheaval for neoliberal ends. I think we're in a slightly different situation by the time we get to the aftermath of 2008, because it's no longer clear that those with that kind of politics can present themselves as merely offering solutions, that they can present themselves to political leaders as having basically treatments, if you like, for the crises at hand. The suspicion is perhaps much more that neoliberalism itself is part of the problem, part of the origins of the crises that are met in the 21st century, and perhaps especially with the with the financial crisis of 2008 and its aftermath. So skepticism, I guess, towards the pioneers of a neoliberal shock doctrine is that much greater by the 21st century. They don't quite fly under the radar to the same degree as they might have done in earlier periods in the late 20th century.
So, so if they're unable to do that, is there still are there still those opportunities to apply something like a shock doctrine in the time of the pandemic? And what does that look like if there is that opportunity now?
Yeah, so this is where we come to the partner piece of Naomi Klein's that we'll be looking at in this session, which is a much more recent piece where exactly she wants to suggest the idea that we are seeing something like a pandemic shock doctrine. In other words, a kind of updating of the formula, if you like, perhaps away from the kind of the classical neoliberalism of the 1970s, 1980s towards something that's more inflected by Silicon Valley, by big data, tech, the great kind of capitalist heartlands of the 21st century, rather than the landscape of the late 20th century. And so basically what you want to describe with the pandemic shock doctrine is, in some sense, the same formula of exploiting crises, in this case, the upheaval surrounding the coronavirus of 2020. But in this case, perhaps not for instituting public policies that we would necessarily call strictly neoliberal, but rather to institute economic transformations that are somehow favoring big data, tech, a certain type of economic model, which is a kind of combination, I guess, of surveillance and enduring currents of capitalism as we've known it across the decades. So this is a kind of a transformation which is about, well, everything that goes with home delivery. So Amazon and the big tech companies that specialize in taking advantage of the isolation of lockdowns and so on. The monitoring by governments of everything that goes to do with the virus. So, checking for whether you are infected with the virus, the apps that are required to take care of your health under these conditions. And I guess notable then in what I'm saying is that we're talking here about something that straddles both the private sector and the public sector. In other words, the pandemic shock doctrine is something that describes a power transformation that's not just about weakening the state in a very general sense, but about transforming it in a way that in some ways empowers the state, but to certain ends which are somehow always inflected by the interests of big capitalist firms of the 21st century. And again, in a way that's more familiar with the previous experience, doing so in a way that perhaps disarms public resistance. Part of Klein's argument, I think, here is very much that some kind of resistance perhaps was building towards big tech in the years before the pandemic, that this was becoming politicized as a feature of contemporary capitalism, but that under the conditions of the crisis and the public health scare that goes with it, that some of that public resistance could be overcome, and the normal checks that might have been placed on these transformations were likewise somehow sidestepped. So the pandemic shock doctrine is in some sense quite familiar for anyone who has read Naomi Klein's earlier work on the shock doctrine, but I think it's also clear that she's updating these arguments in the light of the transformations of capitalism in the 21st century.
And although this month, I think, as I say, we're doing something a lot more contemporary, there are themes that are familiar, aren't there, from our earlier texts?
Yes, I think that's right. In other words, one theme that we've had more than once in our discussions has been to do with how emergency situations can often produce responses that are lingering rather than temporary. In other words, although the license for a political response to crisis is often somehow bound up in the idea that the exceptional measures taken are somehow temporary ones. Clearly, there's also the recurring theme that often what happens in a crisis endures beyond the highest point of the crisis. I think everything that we're talking about with shock doctrines is exactly that thought turned into a political strategy. Clearly, something we also talked about with the last session with Bill Scheuermann's work was to do with how emergencies can somehow embed certain forms of capitalism, how there can be such a thing as an economic state of emergency. I think that's very much a theme that informs what we're talking about today with the pandemic and the handling of it. Although, again, a state of emergency that's somehow not just led by governments, but is a sort of a combination of the power of governments and the power of major economic actors. And again, this theme that we've also encountered of how democratic controls, public resistance, and so on can perhaps be disarmed in such situations. Maybe if I could add one other thought, I mean, I think what's interesting also, though, about the present period, and then perhaps in some ways is different from earlier periods that Klein has been describing in her work, I think there's quite great awareness of exactly these kind of themes in contemporary politics. I think if you talk to people who have lived through the pandemic of the last year, many people are acutely aware of the possibility that such moments can be instrumentalized, that they can be exploited, that there might be something like a pandemic shock doctrine underway, such that certain types of company or certain types of practice of government are being extended under these conditions. And this, of course, is partly because of Klein's previous work. It's almost a reflection of the interest in her previous work that there's something of the kind of the open secret quality about the pandemic shock doctrine, and I think that's in itself kind of interesting. It's not so much that the problem of today is to necessarily unmask this strategy, because I think in some respects the strategy is clear for many to see. There will clearly be debates about who is leading such a strategy and where this shades into conspiracy thinking, where clearly it might very easily. But this is certainly a theme, I think, of contemporary politics, that crises are moments of exploitation. And this is kind of interesting in itself. It suggests that perhaps the main problem today is not just to spot these dynamics at work, but even if you can spot them quite easily, what ultimately are you going to do about them? It's hard to prevent a pandemic shock doctrine once it's underway, even if you can see very clearly what seem to be the trajectories unfolding.
Okay, thank you for that. So the next different class is on Wednesday, 24th of March at 8 p.m. And we'll be on Zoom, and we will send out links to register for that event. Thank you very much, Jonathan, and hope to see everybody there.
See you then. Bye.